Hello to friends in the present and in the future. This session is the skills lab called Common Workflows Leveraging Power Platform with Financial Edge NXT, which is one of the intermediate sessions. I'd be honored to introduce our friend Barton Dyson from NP Automate, who's going to be leading this session. And thanks in advance, Barton, and over to you.
Very well, thank you, Michael. And so that we're going to drill into leveraging everything within the Power Platform during this session and kind of linking it in with everything else that an organization's doing, right? Making it a part, being able to weave it into an overall process. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen. We're going to start with the app showcase, right, at developer.blackbaud.com, because everything we're doing, someone's already done. We're just applying it to our data model, right? So I'm going to try to get you more familiar with our data model today. We are very excited at our company to have had the opportunity to add this connector and make it available for free to everyone within the community. We're constantly making tweaks to this. We were tweaking our own version of this week based on a current project. But it is something that you can capture and then modify yourself. I'll give you some more insight into that. Just quick plug for my organization that I started last year after working with Blackbaud for about 22 years. And we've got a team of consultants and business analysts that focused on consulting elements for, say, Blackbaud products, CRM, Financial Edge, Razor's Edge, but also delivering these automations. So we're going to be talking about and illustrating today some of the things that we've learned, right? Some of the best practices we've learned while we develop some of these interfaces. But I want to try to convey some of those lessons learned to you today and give you some tips on how to really get the most out of this and really optimize some of the things you're doing and make sure they're running fast. So get to the file through GitHub. You can download it. There's instructions there. And so we start by getting that into the system in a couple of ways, right? First, we have to connect it into our developer account, and we can get to that by going over to your applications and making sure it's wired into one of the ones that we are working with. In this case, we're going to be working with an implementation that I'm currently involved in, but in this case, we're dealing with test data. You're not going to see real journal entries or anything else. You're not going to see their data, but we're leveraging that connection. But in order for us to get connected in, we have to embed these values from this developer tool that you created back into Power Automate. And that's the entry point for the work we're going to do today, is to get that connector in there. Because once we have a Financial Edge connector that is accessible through Power Automate and Power Apps, then a lot of things open up for us. Then we can pull data, push data, pull collections, we can update records, we can add attachments, we can monitor certain fields to see what needs to be addressed and then send approvals. So it's all about getting that connector in place. And just about every endpoint is there for GL, for AP, for Treasury. But there's some things that haven't been added yet. Like there's statistical units that have been added more recently to Financial Edge. While that's not there, this is completely accessible for you to monitor, to edit on your own. So if you get comfortable with Json, and there's lots of good documentation around that, you can jump over to an editor and add another component, so to speak, and test that out to say, take advantage of the statistical pieces if you need to be able to pull those or push those to update that information. But it's a lot easier if you just go, in addition to all of these pulls and pushes and things that are already built for you with all the primary endpoints within Financial Edge, it's just a matter of jumping down here in the definition section and adding a new action. And you get all the documentation from the Financial Edge page that you're pulling from. So if you look up, for example, information about a specific API reference point, it gives you a documented schema, and you just drop that right into this section. So a little bit advanced. We're not going to get into all that today, but this connector that you have, you can modify and expand and enhance and optimize and do whatever you want with it by adding these other connectors, which you can test. And then you say it's a get, it's a post, it's an update, the type of connection that's happening and how to define those parameters that may apply. So hopefully the audience has been able to get connected to the connector. I would encourage you, if you're having trouble getting this part working and getting the right pieces identified on that first page where you have to go to security and, bolt on the correct ID and the secret that you got from the developer account, and make sure the refresh is the same as the token. One thing that a lot of people miss, even though the error message will tell you very explicitly, is that this redirect has to be attached back to our application. So in order for, I'm actually servicing this connection through a different link. In order for this developer connection that you've created and then gone to your Financial Edge database and added it, right, by going to applications, that's only going to work with the Power Automate if you have this in place. You've always got to have a redirect to support OAuth 2 and make sure MFA and all those other things are happening. So all the good security is in place. So it just won't work unless that's there. So that's always something to consider. It's always the same value no matter what you're working on until Microsoft changes it. So it doesn't create a different value each time. So once you've got that captured, that's all tackled, you're ready to get to the flows, and we'll take a look at this and see it in action. I'm going to show you a few examples in a moment, and at the end, if we have time, I want to show you a really exaggerated example of something we just developed to check some complicated elements of journal entries and large journal entry batches and identify anomalies and send emails or create additional journal entries based on those to capitalize or to create deferred entries, for example. So I want to get to a few of those examples, but I want to talk through some of the things that we can do in building a flow and how to leverage that connection. So you want to start by just creating a new flow. And so in this case, I've got one created, and you just want it to be a flow with a manual input. So you're going to push a button to kick it off each time you run it. So that's all you really want to think about. And then you want to edit that item that you've created. My computer isn't responding. So the very first, and so in order to get to the screen, you should see something that just says manually trigger a flow. So that's the main thing we need to do right out of the gate, is just, get started and get connected. So what I want to do next is show you some of the things we can do. Within Power Automate, everything's available to us, and embrace the compose action. Compose can be used for so much. If we take a list of 5,000 entries in a journal entry, for example, which is fresh on my mind, as you can tell, and we want to build an array off of that and then filter it and do all this, backflips and machinations to find certain things that don't line up, very specific to an organization's business structure, a compose will do that for you. So that will compose and capture anything, including all these things we already have. So we'll come back to that, but I'm going to highlight a few actions today that are available within Flow that we in Power Automate that we really think has enabled us and empowered us to optimize things even more effectively. And that's one of them, is really take advantage of compose, even in place of creating variables. In a lot of cases, there's ways you can pass things through compose without having to just define a variable, which can impact speed and performance. So we always think about that once we start dealing with things at scale and processes start to run longer. And so you want to kind of think, it's one thing in test, but what's it going to be like when we open it up to every single record that has a certain status attached to it?
Hey, Barton, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we had a question in chat from Ben asking about, where to put the subscription key.
Yeah, the Blackbaud Subscription Key. In other words, your personal subscription key under My Subscriptions, correct? Put it in the custom connectors. You have to edit the connector, and you put it on the definition page. You have to create a scope for it, and you're adding an HTTP header to the call that embeds that subscription. So it's documented on that GitHub page how to do that. But you create I think it's called a scope on the definitions tab, and you add that as an HTTP header. It's fully documented. So what I'd like for you to do, if you see it, and if it's there, is click the custom button. And the first thing you do is you click to add an action. So you click on the little plus right below manually trigger, add an action, and here's all your stuff. Here's email and SharePoint and everything else you have in place. But here's our stuff, right? So you're only going to see this one. This will be the one you added and whatever you chose to call it. And so you want to click that. Once you click that, you're going to see all the values available underneath it. So this is, create an AP address, create a vendor, get a vendor. you'll see update. So the patches are called updates within this. But if you want to do something with a vendor, just type vendor and you'll find that, right? Or in this case, we want to do something with a journal entry. If I can type right. So let's see all the options that exist for journal entries. I don't know why this is taking so long. So we can get a journal batch and read all that good stuff about it. We can see a list of all the entries in a batch. We can add an attachment. We can delete the batch. We can clear the entries in a batch, for example. So each unique endpoint has been designed to let you do something, right? And each one is just connected to a specific REST API endpoint that Blackbaud released. So in this case, let's use the journal entry summary, this guy right here. So choose that. And now we want to input a batch. So in this case, what I want us to do is start by calling on something directly, and then we're going to modify that in a minute and get a little more creative on how we get the ID into the system, maybe even through an app. But right now, what I want you to do is if you have access to a sample database, a live database, we're not going to do anything to an entry. And if any business rules in place in the actual system are also going to be in place within anything we're doing against this API. So it's really important to note that as we're playing around with thee pieces today, we're going to get logged into this. We're going to need that in a moment. It's important to note that as we're playing around with some of these capabilities today, the same security exists, right? But go find a journal entry batch in the system, open it up, and this is the number. This is the magic number that we're looking for. The good thing about Financial Edge and Razor's Edge and Sky is it's consistent, right? So these numbers are always part of the URL, which is exciting. We can embed that into Power BI, for example, to let people look at a report result and link to a record. Or I can send an email to let someone know that an invoice is invalid, needs to be corrected, and provide them a hyperlink to the invoice through the email that I send through Automate just by leveraging that value. So that value is important. It's not this batch number for most of the components of Power Automate. It's always the record ID. And you're always going to get the record ID by looking at the path across the top. This was kind of like the old way of doing it. If any of you worked in version 7 was to click settings and look at the record ID or the import ID. But now it's just what drives the record. So we can create automations around that. So I want you to embed that number inside the batch ID, right? And so that's all we're going to do at this point is try to embed that number in. And I've already done it here. And then I want us to save, give it a name, you can call it test, whatever you want, and then run a test. And so what I'm doing here, I'm doing it kind of quickly, is click test. And we're not doing anything. All we're doing is pulling a result from a batch. Click manual and click test. The reason it's important, you'll see in a minute, is it's really important to understand the schema of data. And it's all about JSON. It's all about arrays. And the more you learn and the more you get comfortable with that, I'm going to show you some tips today of learning how to manipulate and read into JSON and find certain levels. It's going to really empower your ability to optimize your solutions even further. Excuse me. So once you run that process, did I run it? Let's see, maybe I didn't. Run it twice. So once you run that process, it should jump to a page saying, hey, it's running. And this should run super fast. As I say that, it's taking a minute, but here you go. The reason I want you to do one step at a time is because now we get to the output. And everything we do after this is always going to be based on this. And I know early on when I started playing around in Automate, this is where I'd get stuck a lot, where I just didn't have the right syntax or the right way of getting to records, or I wanted to find a thing and it would force me into a loop and wanted me to kind of iterate through a bunch of records when I knew exactly where I wanted to go to get something. And so I think some of the best advice I can give you early on as you start to play with these endpoints and learn about them is if we want to do anything with this result we just got, and we just got results about a journal entry listed right here, and maybe the next step is going to be we're going to look and see the batch status. And if it's open, we do something, or if it's posted, we do something. It's all based on some of this information. Or maybe we're going to use that to drive something else before we go and just get a list of the journal entries. So I just want to show you a little trick, and some of you may be aware of this, but you want to find one of these online JSON viewers. I think if you type online JSON viewer, this is one of the first ones that pops up, but type in this URL. It seems safe to me. Anyway, I hope it is. If it's not, someone please let me know. But jsonviewer.stack.hu. And there's tons of these out there, right? And you could just as easily, I guess you could use a text field, and sometimes I use a notepad to store certain things in, as you'll see in a little bit. But for this, we're just going to capture our result. And it gives us the chance to, there's nothing to format because it's a good, clean JSON array. And that's what we're going to be working with so heavily within Automate. You don't have to, and I'm going to show you some tricks, but this is a really elegant way to start to see everything. So if we wanted to set a formula and say batch status is equal to X and then do Y, we have a little better frame of reference of understanding of how to get there. And so what we can do next is go back to edit. And I want you just to pull a journal entries list. And I'm going to show you one way of doing that from the result of the last entry. Now, this is kind of nonsensical, right? It's the same ID. We're going to pull a list of entries that have been added to this journal entry that we're looking at. But I want to show you another way of getting to that value from the output of this. And so this is pretty critical. This is important to understand, because when you start clicking down here, you start to see values from the other stuff. But this isn't parsed out at all. I'm going to show you how to do that too. But right now it just says body. So that's completely useless. I can't use the entire result we just looked at to do a journal entries lookup. I just need the batch ID. So you can always click that as a starting point, but then you want to modify it. So in this case, I'm just going to copy what I wrote just to make sure I don't forget it. And I'll show you the syntax. But in this case, and if you ever paste and copy like I just did, you highlight it and then copy and paste, it's going to add these at parameters around it. And you just got to remove that before you save it back. You'll follow what I mean. You'll need that for other types of explicit definitions. But what we're asking for was the body of the journal entry summary. And this allows you to start to iterate down to those lower levels and say, I don't want the body to determine what I look up on the next record. I need this batch ID to determine what I look up in the next record. So sometimes it'll be underneath a value section. If you're doing a search endpoint, you've got a count. So it all depends on what you iterate to, and I'll show you that in a moment. But in this case, I just need it to go body, which is everything, which is this, and then go to batch ID and give me that value. So there's tons of videos and education around this, but this is how you do this within arrays. And that's all this result is a JSON array. It's an array. So with this array, we're going to say, all right, we want body, and then we put a question mark to choose the next level down we want to go. And now we're going to say, all right, now I want batch ID, and spell it the exact same. And that's why this is also good, just to make sure you're matching up. And that's why you kind of want to do it one step at a time in some of these cases as you're trying to understand values you're trying to get to. So now hit OK. And now if we run it again and hit test and run, and if your journal entry has 5,000 lines, you're not making 5,000 calls to the FE API, right? Not yet, anyway. We're making 2 calls. So again, the calls are all based on each of these actions that are happening. In the Power Automate world, you're making 5 calls. So every one of these is tracked. So now we have the same value that we had before, but hopefully you got a little tip there on how to start getting to those lower levels of data, right? So now we've got the entries, the 6 lines that were created, but this starts to get a little hairy, especially if you need the project value, because it's nested way down in there. And if you've worked with any complex arrays and JSON arrays, you'll start to see more things like this, arrays inside of arrays, arrays embedded inside of, it's just constant, right? And it can just go and go and go. And so this isn't that bad once you start to learn how to interact with it and understand what you're getting to. Again, parse JSON is a very straightforward way of doing it. I'm going to show you that example too, because it's really good for starting out, and in some cases it's useful. But if you go in this direction and you start saying, okay, I want to take this entire value and I want to put that back in my JSON viewer, which I'm going to clear, suddenly we got much more complicated. Now we have this entire JSON object that first off gives the count. So I can't just ask for a value. It's telling me how many there are, and then it's going to list each one. And so if I want to get to the journal entry ID of the first row of the array, I can get there. I just got to walk all the way out to it, right? But a lot of times what you're going to want to do is iterate through these now. So you've got 6 of these, and you need to analyze them and scan them and see if this value doesn't match that value, and this is wrong for whatever reason. Then we send an alert or we do something, right? But this is everything related to each journal entry, including the array of custom fields, whether it's 1 custom field or 3 custom fields or whatever that may be. So again, that's where this really comes into play, because you can, build these things out, because there's other situations where you're going to be pasting these back in as samples for tasks that you're doing within the system. So, all right, so we know what we have, a batch, we've got some information, we've got a list of entries. So we're going to start looking at some things. So I just wanted to show you a few examples of things that we can do with it, and then I'm going to introduce that parse JSON, which I keep talking about. So one of the things we sometimes want to do is get down to a certain level. And again, we can do that with Compose very elegantly to get to an array. Now, again, arrays are a little challenging, so I'm kind of showing you some more advanced steps. But once you start to get your arms around them, you can go through huge collections of data and just use select, filters, and the select action within Power Automate, and the filter array action within Power Automate with very complex requirements, versus doing an apply to each for 5,000 items, right? Which can be expensive, maybe even from a cost perspective with Microsoft, but also just take a long time, right? So, these things can help you kind of nail that down. So in this case, if we're trying to get to this, these distributions, or sorry, which field was I going to? If we're trying to get to the value and get past that first part that told us there was a list there, we want to start here, because if we don't, we're going to start at the count piece, right? So if you embed this back, you're basically going to get that result. You don't need to embed it back, and you're going to get that result. So the way to kind of get there and just get that list of records without the count piece on top is to do this particular formula. So the body type value. And again, it's not one the system's going to give you, but you can create. So just another kind of idea there. But I digress. Let's see, this one is a very specific example of digging in deep, right? We're going to go to that output we just got. We're going to go to the second row and read the account number. Again, iterating through that array. And so this is just some of the logic and syntax you can use, all formally documented quite heavily. I want you to see some of that. It'll be on the recording for you to refer back to. But what is another really simple and nice way to do this is through parse JSON. And anytime you're dealing with a collection of data from anywhere, just go ahead and do that as a next step. Now, what's important about this particular function is you need to be able to capture it with a schema. And so that's why you always want to run the prior step so you can put it there, right? And so if I open link here, you can see how I just right-click that to get over here. And I go back to the last one that ran, because I've got to have an example here. And we're going to take this output from the summary. I can paste this back in as a sample of the output that's here, right? So that's awesome. So the first thing I got to do is tell it what I'm looking at. Well, I'm looking at the body, the result of the journal entry summary. The awesome thing about Automate is it populates the things that you can use as you iterate through. What this is going to do is let us see every field within that without having to use all my weird formulas or all the JSON and array action we were just talking about. So you don't want to paste the schema here. You want to generate from sample and paste it here. Now, I've found there's times where you can go to the Financial Edge developer page for the API and paste in that schema or paste in that sample schema. It just always seems to work better off your own data. And sometimes I have to redefine certain fields for whatever reason. So it's always the best practice to run the process, get the output, and then embed that as the JSON. And it's just normally going to work the first time you try it. You can embed these. We can call it, parse summary. But let's just go ahead and save that and rerun it. So now what this does for us is the output isn't that enlightening. It's giving us the same thing. Here's what went in. We put a schema around it, and we're getting the same thing out. So that doesn't excite me too much. But wait till you see this. My apologies if this is repetitive for some of you, but let's say I want to create a condition again, or create a formula, or populate, sorry, not a condition, a compose. And again, compose is just elegant because it can do so many things. It can capture an integer or a string or a very complex array and do different things. Maybe even take an array and take each row and include line break so it shows nicely in an email. So there's lots of things you can do with it, but it's not just composing strings. It's composing data and really helping you manipulate data. So in this case, now when I click compose, notice what the parse JSON has done for me. Now all this stuff is here. So now we can, instead of just asking for body, which was the only option before, which was pretty useless, we had to dig in manually. Now we can say, no, I need the batch ID. So now when I go to JA list, now I can ask for the batch ID, or I can ask for the outputs of compose, which is also the batch ID. So hopefully that makes sense, but that's where parse JSON is really incredible because it'll break all that information down for you. Now this was a simple array because it was only one result. It was only one journal entry summary. But if you have something like a list and you need to iterate through every item of that list, well then let's create a parse for that and see what we can do. If I can type correctly. So parse JSON, let's base it on that journal entries list. And again, let's look at what the list result was from a prior run. Capture that. And you'll see, again, we got this whole thing in here with the count. So it's not just a simple list of one batch. There's a count. There's all these other things kind of wound into the array. And I made a mistake because I put it there. I should have put it under generate from sample. So now we have that further defined within the system. But let's see here. So the next step we can take is to do something with it. And apply to each is a very elegant way, especially when you're getting started. You're going to find as you spend more time, you can use the filters and the select for volume. But apply to each is a wonderful way to start getting comfortable with these endpoints and what you can do. So now we can say, for each of these items in the list, I want to do something. I want to look at it. I want to scan it. I want to see if something's wrong and send an email. And so you get there by going to that JSON2, and this is where the naming gets important. Right? You start to build these out and they get really complicated. Maybe you want to call it parse journal entries or journal entry list. So once you have that naming down, the body we already know is going to be pretty useless. That's everything. We don't want to say for each amount because that's going to create another apply to each actually, and you'll want to leave the screen. So what you want to always use is value. Apply to each value is going back to this and saying, okay, under value, I had 6 different settings through, it starts at 0 based, through a clean array. So I don't want to apply to each here. I don't want to apply to each, I want to apply to each value. And that's really critical. Once you get a handle on that, then things just come through clean. Because if you choose the wrong thing, sometimes Automate will try to get smart and create another apply to each because you're pulling from multiple items. And, just save as often as you can. And if you make that kind of mistake, sometimes just leave the screen and come back because it'll get a little wonky. But it's just a very specific thing it'll try to do sometimes. So now we're saying, all right, for each value, now we want to capture something. And again, I'm just using compose to show you what we're getting. But now let's capture something within those. Now let's capture the amount. All right, I did that wrong. See what I mean? It just went and added another piece. So apply to each. Compose. All right, so now we need a value from Parse JSON too. I know why that didn't work. So it's either debit or credit. So let's ask for that. I actually clicked an amount field. It was an embedded amount field. So I clicked an amount field that lived all the way down in the distribution section of a certain line. So that's why it blew up when I did that and tried to add another apply to each. And that was exactly what I mean. But now let's just add a type code and leave it at that. So again, it doesn't matter what fields you're working with, but once you get to that parse JSON, then you can start to kind of analyze and look at things and compare. And you can use the condition clause, some of the other, or the condition action and others to kind of see what's happening and compare the data and then send an email. And that'll be the last step here before we look at some variations of this.
And maybe I'll ask a question there, Barton, because I feel like I've run into trouble with the condition before, because there are certain functions that it doesn't let you perform after a condition's been put into a flow, or maybe that was a control. But is that, and maybe that's not a question, maybe it's just a heads up for everybody else. But is that something that you've run into when working with Power Automate, and any advice there on where and how to place things that might be conditional?
Yeah, well, I think what I've run into, and I think what you're referring to, is sometimes you set a value and then you get nested in a process and you can't get to that value anymore, right? It was part of kind of an if then or a condition or something else, and you weren't able to populate it. We try to mitigate and completely minimize the use of variables, but sometimes you have no choice. We try to really minimize them within loops because you can support parallel processing and do things in a more asynchronous way if you're not having to capture those. So for example, if we're having to iterate through 5,000 lines and you need to update a variable either way, yes or no, on each one of those lines you're scanning, you can't do a parallel process because you're having to update a variable each time. But the reason I'm kind of going long-winded there is variables will typically help you get around that problem you're talking about. So if you go ahead and initialize a variable on the front end, and then you populate that variable somewhere based on a condition or a switch case at a nested level, you can still get to it somewhere else. But there's some other ways of doing that just with using the compose. And there's something on the internet. You could type Power Automate Peter method, P-I-E-T-E-R, and some really sharp developer who figured out a nice way to pass, that works beautifully to pass parameters and values of, say, an array or a value from within and apply to each and pulling it back out. And so a lot of times that's what people run into, is they put a value somewhere and they can't get it later in the process to use. And so that should help with that workaround, so hopefully.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Barton.
So we parsed that JSON, we got all this stuff, but then we created an apply to each. So under that apply to each, we created something, right? And so we went through 6 records. And so if you have all these steps that take place, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a moment, they're all going to be listed here. But for each of these, we're getting a value. So, you know, our next question at that point, I don't exactly know what's going on. Our next question at that point could be, you know, if it equals debit, then we're going to send an email. Or if the something else doesn't match something else, we're going to send an email. But you've got all the data. Now you've got all the information you need to work with. And so once you get the data, then you can use the public tools within YouTube and Microsoft.com and learn.microsoft to figure out the best way to use, you know, the and operators and conditions and the set filters and others to kind of interact with that, so to speak, right? I think it's important to note too, if I get back to edit, that, you know, the same logic applies to opening a project, right? Or using the project ID to add an attachment to a project. So, you know, certainly try these out, play with them, and see, you know, some of the options that are available. One thing we may want to do is either within an apply to each, or let's pull it back out of the apply to each and just say, you know what, I'd like to send a email to someone based on a certain value or something like that, and ask them to approve it. And this is something we do quite a bit of in projects that we perform, where someone wants to approve something, right? Based on something that's happening in the system, we want to notify someone, we want to send them some type of approval. There's 2 that you'll want to use, and one that works a little better than the other. So if there's Send email with options if you want to have an approve and decline button. And I'm going to show you that one. But you can also just send an email V2 is better because you've got total control and you can like do the HTML of it, right? So it just offers more flexibility of kind of what you're sending out. So if you need an approve and a decline button, that's one thing. But if you just want to send an email out to someone and alert them to something, like tell them something didn't match up or wasn't right, want to provide a hyperlink and format it better, you want to use send an email V2. But send an email with options is awesome because we can put options in here. We can say approve, decline. That's going to show on the email. And so when we send this, and at this point, send it to yourself. If we should have time to bolt this on to a Power App here in just a second, and we'll look at some other options there. But for now, just put it in there. You can put more info in the body. You can attach something if you want. You can leverage other information. You can capture attachments through our connectors. So a few things you can do, but setting up that approved decline. Now when we save this and run it, I'm going to receive an email. And I haven't even put anything in there, but from the body, I can input in, actually, let's do that to put something there. Not information about the journal entry. I want to use the information about the batch. So batch ID. This is probably going to format horribly because, again, I prefer HTML, but you can still do it with page breaks here or line breaks here. That's fine. But let's run this. So again, this is the idea where you can send something and notify them and alert them to things on that record, right? And if you see this batch ID field, that's all you need to create a URL back to that web page. So if you want to provide them a hyperlink back to that page, all you need to do is paste in that URL, HTTPS, your tenant ID and everything else, and just put that batch ID, put this value by clicking it right in the heart of it before it has your tenant ID in there. So that'll allow that person who receives the email to see a nice hyperlink to take them directly to the record, right? So that's pretty slick. Emails typically run fast, but this one's taking a minute. In terms of reliability, and we're building some pretty large automations. I haven't seen this thing stumble at all, or even as we're building them, it doesn't seem to, I've never seen it be unstable. When you have certain things that run on schedules, maybe they might run 5 minutes later than they normally should. But something is odd here. Oh, well, that's part of it. No. You know what? I don't think I have the ability to send an email through that connection because I was doing this on the back end. So I'm going to cancel. I typically have a different account. So, but you should have received an email with an approve or decline button. What's important to note about that is your next step can be what the result of that was. You can do a conditional if statement and say, if approved, do this. If declined, do that. And so that's what's most critical about having the ability to do a send email with options is your next step can be a conditional if. And so we can do condition, and they don't call them if statements in here, they call them conditions or select filters. And we can identify something that happened. In this case, there's a selected response. That's the approve or the decline button. And if that's equal to approve, now we do something. Maybe we go back and update the record and mark it approved, right? We go and update that particular field. Or maybe we do something else. But hopefully this has given you some insight of how we can get to a record, start to play a little bit in the array and in the data, maybe iterate through to do something. And this is where people typically get stuck, to Michael's question of, they'll set a value here or a compose here, and I can't see compose for from down here because it lives within each one of these, right? So I wouldn't be able to add an action here and get to this, but using that Peter method I mentioned, P-I-E-T-E-R, as long as you're not nested more than once, you can accomplish that. Or you can do the same thing by creating a variable. Like maybe you're going to create a variable and you're going to append this to that variable each time. And then down at the bottom, you just capture that variable result. So give you a really expanded example of this particular flow or something like this that we created. And not looking at any data here, but this is an example of one that is, if I can do it, the one that is essentially running through, and let's see which one I want to do. I want to do the GL location check. We're going through and we're validating every line of a journal entry and making sure the third segment of the GL account matches up with a project custom field, which requires the entry of another endpoint, the project summary. And they, in this case, have over 4,000 projects. They're also feeding this from a Power App. And I'm going to show you in just a moment, we're going to start digging into how to do that and get it back to Financial Edge, which I hope to leave you with today. But in doing that, we can pass parameters. So two things are being passed from the Power App. Number one, which record am I sitting on? Which record are we looking at? When I push this button to send approval, or in the other case to check the location, I'm going to pass two things. One, I'm going to pass this value, so this particular solution knows which batch to look up. And the other one is I'm going to pass the input of the person that clicked it, which Power Apps knows as part of MS365. So those are two pretty useful things. Now I know who to send the email to if I'm going to have a push button on the record. And now I know which record they clicked, whether it's a project record, a grant record, a vendor record, invoice, whatever. That's always made available to you. And that's very well documented on this Power Apps add-in page of how some of these pieces are being connected and the values that are being passed. So definitely check that out. It's under the Power Apps section at Blackbaud. And this is something we're going to look at in just a moment to see how quickly we can get that in. All right, so going back to this example, this was super nested, like it went 3 levels of nesting. So this is an example, Michael, where we had to go and define some things. We had to define a project location code that we were going to compare to the other. We had to count the journal entries after we discovered there was over 5,000 journal entries, over 5,000 records. But to support pagination, the first time you make a call against a really large record, and Blackbaud will always tell you what the limit is. Go back to that developer page. The limit for entries is 500, which is really low. But since that is, I'm immediately getting a journal count at the beginning of that feed of how many there are. And if it's over 500, then I do it again. If it's over 1,000, then I do it again. And in the end, I append all that together into one gigantic array, in this case of 2,000 entries. And that becomes the all transactions array, right? So that's how you're getting to that value. But it has to be a formula in order to get to that because of some of the nesting we're doing. So these formulas aren't just capturing like a value. This is capturing 4,000 lines, right? If you try to view it, you can't even view it on the page. It'll pop up another page and show you a big text file, which is that result, which you can paste into this, and you can see every bit of it. So again, that's where this becomes valuable when the data gets really complex. We have another element where we're capturing the result of the new journal entry that we're having to create in this case if we need to create a new transaction. So all of these things are happening, but I wanted to illustrate this because there's so much different logic taking place. There's a lot of steps. This looks like a house of cards, but it's not. It's going through, it's making the connections. You'll see we're heavy users of Compose as one of the cleanest and most efficient ways to do things. When we first built this, someone was doing a project search within the apply to each. Well, that's good if it's 7 records, not good if it's 4,000 records. So we pulled that out and did it once and then tied it back in and basically combined 2 records. So this is really a kind of extreme example of the different ways that we can start to interact with this, because we had to look for 2 problems. We had to, number one, see if a record was missing a project because they don't have that requirement for other reasons. And then we had to check and see if the project location didn't match a custom field in the segment. So if either option existed, we had to send an email with that result. What's brilliant here is we just took those array results and then used this little trick to kind of compose it with a BR, as you see there, to make it light up nicely. So if there's 4 rows that are faulty, then it's going to show real nicely, even though I'm just dumping an array output into the email. It's not just looking like this massive text file. So I'm showing, here's your invalid location, here's your projects, oh, and click here to go look at the record and fix it right away from anywhere. So you get it on your phone, you click it, you can address it from your phone if you have access to the system. So the hyperlink trick's kind of cool. Just use the OpenA, the standard HTML, and then just embed that value directly in there. So that's how it gets to that, just sending that out. So, all right, so jumping back to our illustration, I want to see if we can run this from a Power App or from a schedule, right? It's one thing to like click a button and run something, but let's actually run it when, you know, more elegantly, right? Off of a record or based on a schedule. Every couple of hours, let's go and scan for problems and then do something to fix it or send an email to someone. Two ways we can do that. One, we can click on a record. We can edit that record. And instead of manually trigger, and even if we change this, you can always manually trigger by hitting test. We're going to do a different input. Now we're going to do a schedule. And I'm not going to program this. I'm just going to show it to you to give you an idea. So if we've got something where instead of looping through one journal entry, we're looping through all journal entries, and then we're looking at stuff within all journal entries, which we have examples of. And then if certain things happen, we do things, but we check it 3 times a day. That's where a schedule comes in. So maybe once a day, but then we want to define at what times, at what hours. Let's do it at 8 and 2 o'clock, and then let's add some minutes to it. You know, if you want to do it like during the week and not on the weekends, I think you can set it to week and then narrow down the days. Lots of advanced ways of doing this if you want. But, you know, you have some ways of ensuring that you're checking it as often as you need to for what's most appropriate for a process. And check it as often as you need to and not more, right? Because these are just processes that are running. Sometimes we use audit tools like Azure SQL to, if we're having to scan journal entries and kind of scan through every record to see if certain values exist, you know, with large data sets, we're going to go ahead and populate something when we're done to say, hey, we've already looked at that. We don't need to look at it again. So we have some examples where we use Azure SQL, like the last one, to denote we've already checked this to see if we need to do a deferred journal entry. We don't need to check it again. So that saves a lot of time when you have these schedules that are constantly running against everything that meets certain criteria, like as of a certain date. And so what you want to do at that point is, instead of using journal entry summary, there's another one you can use, this journal entry list. And then you can put in kind of search criteria of anything on or before or anything after this date. None of those use date time, but you can say anything after January 1, go ahead and look at, or anything within the last 4 days. Maybe that's more appropriate. So some good tricks to do it. You just can't use the time element to try to do some synchronization. And that's why we typically like to use an audit table instead. So forget the recurrence. We don't want that either. We want to use Power Apps. We want to tie all this together. So I'm not seeing Power Apps. Here it is, Power Apps. So now this is really tricky, we found, when we need to add inputs from an app and feed it to a flow, and the order we do it. And there's times where we feed one input where we fed the record ID, but then we wanted the person's email address. And you can't add that afterwards because the system's like, wait, we've already created this manual connection between your flow and your app, and it only requires one input. So you can always go back and fix that literally by just removing it from the app, as I'll show you in a moment, and also removing it here. Just delete it, delete everything, close out, and then go back in and try it again and reset it. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. The first step always starts with flow. Say you're going to do a Power App, and then define what you're going to grab. And so the next thing you want to do is tell Power Apps how many records and how many elements we're going to send over. So in other words, you want to click, and this is before we've done anything in Power Apps. If you've already done it there, you just want to remove the connection, and then we'll come back to it. But you want to click Ask in Power Apps. And I screwed that up, and I'll show you why in just a moment. I think you can clean it up, but I'm actually going to remove it. I can show you what I mean. I like to rename the compose first, because as you noticed, it literally picked up the compose name as the field that we're going to be passing, and I didn't want to have some wonky compose field. So now I'm starting over. This should allow me to start over. Wait, compose. And this time we're going to rename it to record ID. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. And just again, spelling is typically pretty literal, so it's good to stay that way. So we're back at this. But now it's going to say record ID underscore input. So that looks a little better, right? If we're going to be passing things between apps and Automate, that's a little bit cleaner. But I want a second input. I want it to also have the email. So we're going to create another input. And you have to use it somewhere within Automate first in order for it to create this parameter. And that's what I think is kind of weird. You can't define it from the app side. So email. All right, that's easy enough. I don't want this one. That's an output. I want this one to create a new one. So now we just added another one called email inputs. So now we have two inputs that we can use. And hopefully that's helpful to you in the future. And we're going to apply it now. So, all right, so save that. Make sure everything you've done is saved. And now you've basically told Power Apps that, hey, I've added a new flow that you can play with. And so that's great. So let's go over to apps. And let's go to my FENXT app test. And let's edit that. In a minute, an app should open up. And this typically takes longer for whatever. Automate's fast, but boy, opening these apps to edit takes a minute for some reason, especially early on. So, okay. So this is a variant of an app I built for a customer that's living in Financial Edge. Right now it's in test. And this is a variant of that. But there's three things that they were doing. They were clicking one button to check locations and send an email if the locations didn't match, like I've been talking about, and others to create journal entries. But this is the one we want to talk about. You're going to create a button, right? And you can do whatever you want on your Power Apps page. You can go to Power Apps, click New. I would recommend a Canvas Power App in this case if you're building one. Typically easiest to kind of get to work with the Blackbaud Sky add-ins. It's actually the only type I've really worked that heavily with. I haven't done a lot with the model types, but the model driven. But Canvas gives you a canvas, right? You can build it for a phone. You can build it for an iPad. Typically present it this way, so it'll fit a little more nicely within a tile because people are expanding it and shortening it, as opposed to kind of the iPhone view. But you need a button, and that's the main thing you need is a button. So create an app, get to this screen, and add a button to it. So if you've done that, you're well on your way. The next thing you're going to do is click this action button up here. So action is where we're going to embed this and connect Power Automate to that button and send parameters. There was a lot of trial and error the first time I started playing with this, and I don't know, I hope this saves you a few steps. So send approval is the thing that we kind of built out, right? That process that you built today. And that's this test flow that's listed right here. I want to call the thing that we've developed. So you should see it listed right here. If you've clicked your button, if you've clicked action, if you click Power Automate, you should see the thing that you built. And so click the button, not over here, and choose to add it. So all of a sudden it's going to be associated with this record. But that's not enough. Now we got to tell it something. So first off, we can just leave it like that. Why is that not okay? Oh, you know why it's not okay? Because it's already reading my flow. So if I didn't have any parameters defined, if I just opened up a flow to start by Power Apps, and I didn't really need to capture any parameters, and I have a few examples of that we've delivered, you don't need to pass anything. You just need to initiate it. This is just when it starts. And so that's just passing it. So if you don't ever do that Ask in Power Apps button that I talked about and kind of associating parameters you're going to pass, then you just type the name of the thing, .run, and then you just close the parameters. You just close the parentheses and it goes. But in this case, we need some stuff. So the first off, we need to input, it's telling us what order. Like first, we need you to tell us what record ID, then we need you to give us the email. So that's great. Well, I did this little thing over here that you don't, I don't know if you have to do this, but this is what I always do. Someone at Blackbaud taught me this a long time ago. So if you create a text input field, and you can hide it, look, no one sees it, but this is that in the app, it's actually going to show that value. And I think if I don't hide it, let's see if that'll work. Visible, sorry. Then it'll show when I pull up a record. But we're basically telling the system what the value is, right? We need to pass this record ID dot text or value back into that parameter that we saw. And that's going to be the record ID, right? And I totally forget if it's, let's see, record, starts to type with you, that's good, dot. I always forget if it's text or value, but this one is totally text. I'm like really, really proficient in Automate, and I know enough about apps to be dangerous. So I'll kind of highlight that. But this is the hardest part, is passing stuff back and forth, right? Some of you are going to be really good at making this pretty and do some exciting stuff, and I'll show you how to feed results back, but you just got to get that value. The second part of that we need to capture is the email inputs. And I'm trying to remember what I put in for that. See, I mentioned this in my last class. I use Notepad like crazy to like build things and test things. And this is a really complicated condition I'm using through an array to find certain transactions that meet certain criteria. So I just kind of build off of these things to build other things. But in this case, if you type user, open close parentheses, .email, that's what you're getting. You're literally capturing the person in MS365 through Active Directory that clicked that button. So now we've got those two values. We've got the email address and we've got the record ID. So that's just a matter of save once you've given it a name, and then click publish. That should be all you need to do. If you go to Blackbaud, if you go back to that connector that you, that connection that you made, so to speak, and you want to add a certain connection. These are the two that I added this morning. Oh, hold on, I've got a different one running. Here it is, Power Auto Test. See, I'm looking at too many environments. So these are the two I added this morning. This is critical. You need to add this certain path in to the solution. And really all you need, before we get to the remove inset and all these other things that are very well documented on the Blackbaud side, the main thing I want you to worry about right now is the app ID and the tenant ID. And you're going to get all of that from the FE or from the app itself. So let's close this and make sure you saved it and published it, even though it says you have it saved. Let's edit it again. Yeah, whatever. Just trying to get to the value of the app that we can embed. That's not even giving it to me. Let me see if I can share it. Sometimes going to share gets you the value. We're trying to get that app value out of the system. If I close that and embed that, and go back to my applications, you would want to put that in. Now I see what's incorrect here. Hold on. I'm totally backwards here. Okay, so here's where we're doing this last JE app. So if you want to build one of these from scratch, you want to give it a name. Let's choose the extension point. And we're going to put this on the journal entry. And then you want to paste in the value. Now, again, that's very well written over here, where you've got to start it off with this app.blackbaud.com/add-in-power-host, right? So that's where you start, and then you just embed your number. So then you just plug in your app ID that goes with that. And so the tenant ID represents the Power Platform tenant. I can't remember if I always use that, but you can just, it's not a required field. I don't think, unless you can get around the guest access, but you really just need that value, right? So if you set up, and then just for time's sake, I'm going to jump over and show you the result. But if you bolt that on here, if you use this that's been provided by Blackbaud, and then just tie in your app ID equals and plug it in, they're going to put that in the tile for you, the Power App that you're looking for. So the end result of that would be this thing that exists, and I'm going to refresh this. As we're waiting for this to pop back up, see here, here's the value. So let's send approval, and let's see if anything happens. That should instantaneously start something, right? So I mean, really, all you have to do is go and refresh a page, and it's running, right? It started 9 seconds ago, and we can watch it while it's running. So here's what's taking place, and it started in the Power App, and it gave us those 2 outputs, right? Cool, we got what we needed. All right, here's that value. Now, I didn't use it within the lookup, but I could have, right? I could have just embedded that value, record ID, in the journal entry summary. So that's cool, and the journal entries list. That's great. And then I could use that email input later on by just clicking send email with options, clicking in the 2 box, and that button's available for me. It's just something I click. So that's run all the way through. Again, I'm hung up on this email because I don't believe I have rights to actually send an email through this account. So that would make sense why that's completely stuck on that step. So one thing you could do with this is respond back to the Power App. I see some cases where people want you to be able to click a button and then say, hey, you can't do this, it's already posted. Or here's the result of what we looked at. And you want to be timely, because if it's something that's going to take more than 30 seconds, don't make them wait for a response, right? Just have something that fires off and they get an email later about it. If you don't choose to send a response back to Power Apps, every time you click this button, it's going to start a process, but it's not going to sit there and look like it's just hung up looking for something. But if within your flow, you go through and say, okay, this is cool, I'm going to add an action or a parallel branch, and one of the things I'm going to do is respond to Power Apps, if I can type correctly, then at that point, it's going to wait until it gets to that spot to stop processing. So at that point, you would see it kind of running a little like thinker up here, running until it gets to that step, and then it feeds something back. So you want to be cognizant of that. Excuse me, if you don't have that in place, you just click it and the person can move on. They can move on anyway, but it'll look like it's just running. But this would be a way to kind of interrupt a process right away through like a condition, yes, no, is the transaction posted? If not, let's run this response. And then let's send a text message back to the app with a specific message, right? So that's where you can have a nice message that says, you can't do this transaction's already posted. So if that is helpful. So
Thank you again very much, Barton, from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of everybody here.
All right, thank you for letting me join today.
All right, thanks so much, folks.